I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, let's welcome new Thought Evolutionary, pastor, mentor, blogger, and advisor to spiritual communities, Jim Lockard. Jim has much to share about his focus on building beloved community together. Wise counsel for those of us who desire community in these troubled times, Jim Lockard. All right. Well, I am thrilled.
Okay.
I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to welcome Jim Lockard to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. This I just know will be a remarkable episode of this podcast. Those who've been watching on a regular basis know that I'm tending to veer a bit away from what can be a bit repetitive in terms of updates of the collapse of Earth and human systems, or more of the bad news about if it be politics or climate change. There's plenty of that, and there are plenty of other podcasts and bloggers who do it far better than I do and far more consistently than I do. And where I've been really landing for quite some time now, especially as I'm putting together the new book and workbook combination and a lot of online learning content, I'm able to spend a lot more time on really where my focus has been all along and is more so now than ever. And that is our connection with the primary sources of meaning in human life, which those who've read The Impossible Conversation, you'll have read that 100 times or more in that book. That's what I'm asserting happened to get us to this brink, to not only the problems and challenges that we face globally, but also especially the predicaments that we're in. And Jim, I just really want to warmly welcome you here, and I want to just full disclosure let folks know that we are just meeting now, and I so appreciate your willingness to do that. To get with a weirdo like myself and have these conversations. And I want you to know that I'm really drawn to a particular depth and level of granularity that you take your blog posts to, and how they seem to address exactly the center of what I was just talking about, which is that reconnection to the primary sources of meaning. And I would like it if you're willing, I'd like to touch in on as much of your recent posting of 4 different episodes. Links, of course, I'll put in the show notes of your blog, and those are particularly about creating a community, a sense of community in which there is that sense of reconnecting at a core level with one another, which of course would be reflected in a religious orientation, which you've had and have, and which I have had far, far less of in my life. I think both are very similar conversations, just different trappings and different orientations of our focus and of our attention, but I have found your work to be really inspiring, and why that is worth saying from you right here is that I have never been a particularly religious person, and if anything, I have been antagonistic to any sort of organized religion until my engagement with this whole notion of the collapse of Earth and human systems, and wondering what the heck are we going to do in the face of this daunting present and future we find ourselves in. So thank you, Jim, for sitting through this kind of bridging explanation of why we're talking today. And I'm wondering if any particular part of what I've just said sparks you in any way, because I'm very open to us being relatively free form.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd also be wide open to you introducing yourself in any way you'd like to be known and introduced. So, Jim.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Just really quickly, my blog, which is called New Thought Evolutionary, is really aimed at people in spiritual leadership, whether it's they consider themselves religious or not, but I work with spiritual leaders. I do consulting and some coaching and things like that. And I have a book called Creating the Beloved Community that's really about, can we bring the best of ourselves into leadership so that we're able to do the important work that is on our plate to do? Because when we enter into, whether it's social justice work or whether it's trying to deal with the huge impending issues of the day, if we don't show up as whole and complete as we possibly can, we tend to do either no good or we do actually harm.
Yeah.
So a big focus of mine has been to try to help leaders to become more equipped to deal with these important things by realizing their own wholeness first. And so certainly the issues of climate collapse, the issues of that we're dealing with, and all of the ancillary things that are coming along with that, from immigration to just everything. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a part of society that isn't affected in the coming near future into the next decade or two. So to me, religion and spirituality can offer a dimension of human beingness that ideally can bring a sense of compassion, a sense of connection, and when it's done well, it can do those things very well. When it's done poorly, it can make things like that more difficult to find.
Yeah.
So there we, I understand fully when you say you had kind of an antipathy toward organized religion, and I'm part of an organization called Centers for Spiritual Living, and I always tell people, if you don't like organized religion, you'll love us because we're not that organized. But it is a newer kind of a lot of the more traditional religions are kind of bound by doctrine that was developed in previous times before scientific awareness and things like that. And it makes them tend to be a little sclerotic in terms of how they deal with newly discovered scientific ideas and things like that.
Yeah.
And that impedes the ability of religion to do what it does best in times like we are facing today.
Got it. Well, thank you for that. That's really important context. I'd like to just mention a couple of other pieces that really caught my eye, and I guess they fit in that arena you just described for us, that in which there's more fluidity, there's more inclusion of relevant elements that might not be included in a more traditional format. One is your mention of shadow dimensions of us individually, and of course collectively, if we're talking about building any kind of community at any level. And I find that refreshing. It's definitely at the center of my body of work, is including elements like shadow, and also more recently the inclusivity issues that you mentioned just remarkably and refreshingly well in this series of 4 blog posts that I mentioned. And I'd also like to just put a earmark, and whether we reach this point in the conversation, if you have anything to say about them, great. And if not, I'm sure we have plenty already. Excuse me. I believe that we are in a time of remarkable trauma and violence, and not so much necessarily because evidently there's statistically less violence going on in the world evidently right now than for many decades past. But I have the experience of tremendous amount of trauma, like an ambient delivery of trauma around the world, and especially in the USA right now. And that implies a certain kind of violence that I believe we're having to grapple with, either consciously or unconsciously in our culture as well. So again, let me just stop there. I'm just added a couple of pieces. If they spark you in any way, I'd love to hear your response. Otherwise, if you'd like to just go back to anywhere in your series of 4 blog posts about community, I'm willing to start wherever you'd like to go.
Okay. Well, let me just touch on shadow a bit, and that's, we're talking about the concept developed primarily by Carl Jung, which he termed the shadow, which is all the stuff that we repress as we're growing up. From the time we leave the womb, we tend to notice that some aspects of ourselves aren't welcome. And that's part of the civilizing process that every child experiences. No matter how well you're parented, you're going to have some shadow. And so, I'm in the sandbox with my friend, and I take his toy because I don't have a sense of private property. And he cries, and my mother comes out and smacks my hand and gives it back to him and says, "You can't do that." And that happens 4 or 5 times in a row. And something in me says, I'm going to make myself not take that toy. I don't understand why. I don't understand what's going on. But what I end up with is a repressed aspect of myself, my inner thief, let's say. And later in life, that although I've repressed it, it hasn't gone away. It stays active subconsciously, and I start to project it onto others. So a lot of our human discord is this projection process of repressed aspects of ourselves. You see it played out in cases where the biggest anti-porn crusader in town turns out to have the biggest porn collection hidden away.
Right.
That kind of thing, where the repressed energy just gets projected out and projected out.
Yeah.
So I think that's something in my book. I talk about that a lot in terms of leaders being willing to deal with that aspect of themselves, so that they're not contributing to the dysfunction of all this projection going back and forth.
Beautiful.
So that's a piece, and in the 4 segments I just did on creating more diversity and inclusion in your community, while it speaks to the idea of diversity in terms of race, in terms of LGBTQIA, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of ageism and things like that, it also speaks to any kind of difference where someone with a different idea isn't welcome, or you may think they're welcome, but your behavior that's subtle, that's shadow-based, gives them such signals that it's not welcome, and you're puzzled why they don't stay around. An example would be in terms of age. A lot of our spiritual communities are kind of older. They're people there's not a lot of young people around. So I spent quite a bit of time over the last number of years talking to young adults about that. And, one great story I got was this young man who was about 27 or 28, and he goes to church in a New Thought community in California. And he says, the people after service, they're coming up and they're treating me like I'm their grandson, and they're actually pinching my cheek. He says, I want to be accepted as an adult in an adult community. I have something to offer. I want to be sitting at the table. And, and it's not like they're not like they don't want him there. They actually enjoy having him there, but their unconscious biases and the way they see him make it impossible for them to see the potential contribution that he could be making, for example. So that's an example. And the more we do that in our communities, the more dysfunctional we become and the more closed off and insular we become. We see that in our politics today, in particularly in the United States, where it used to be you could just disagree with somebody politically and not talk about it. Now, if they disagree with you politically, they have to be made into an enemy, and you can't talk to them. You're not supposed to associate with them in any way about anything because they must be wrong about everything. And that extension into that kind of a consciousness makes us so susceptible to being impotent to deal with the challenges and opportunities of a time like this. Yes. So that's part of the problem. And I see, spiritual organizations could be helping to heal that, but many of them are doing the same thing. Many of them are at the forefront of these divisive kinds of practices based on outdated doctrine or based on misunderstandings or misreadings of scripture, or based on simply not unhealed aspects of the shadow self. And we end up making a paradise a hell as a result.
Yeah. Wow. Well said. And I'm just so, it warms me to know that not only that you have that orientation yourself, but then really what you've taken on as a role of being a mentor, it sounds like, to other spiritual leaders. That gives me some kind of encouragement that that somewhere that negative tide that you've been describing so well, in our communities, in our politics, in everywhere, that there's something else being introduced, some other possibility in being, and that's I believe what you were using as a container for this conversation that you have in these blog posts about building community. I guess there's one, but before we talk at any detail about those, your kind of instructions or your primer for people about building an inclusive community, I'm curious if you would just take a moment with me to explore whatever, just personally, on a personal note, when you look out at the world and you take a look at it through the filter of what are our least examined and most impactful shadows that are present right now on a larger scale. I'm wondering if there are particular manifestations of our collective shadow that really have your attention, that really concern you right now. And I'm happy to start with my own if that's not a clear question.
No, I think I get it. I think it varies by different parts of the world. I think one of the collective shadows we have in the West is the shadow of colonialism and all of the things that happened as a result of that 300 years or so, where European powers were colonizing the world and enslaving people and killing people and for economic and other purposes. That's never really been healed. I think that is brought to our doorstep today. I know I live in France, and in Europe you have the collective refugee problem that can all be traced back to colonial behavior and post-colonial behavior on the part of the West, the the people that are leaving their homeland are often leaving it because it's become inhabitable directly or indirectly as a result of behavior of Western powers. And the United States certainly has their share of collective shadow with slavery and with the Native American population and all of that. Very little of which was seen as a pure evil at the time it was occurring. But today, it's sort of like we've grown up. It's sort of like we've grown up and we realized we were on a drunken spree in our adolescent years and did a tremendous amount of damage. And let's say we killed a lot of people, and now we have to come to terms with that. And what I see happening pretty much across the West, with a few exceptions, is that we're not willing to come to terms with it. We're not willing to deal with the uncomfortable, painful process of going within and really looking at those truths, just as most of us aren't willing to do it within our own personal lives. Yeah. Germany, I think, has made great strides in terms of trying to heal some of the issues around the Holocaust, unevenly, but nevertheless, at least the government has been strongly in favor of that kind of reconciliation, and that's an exception. You don't see the same thing happening on any significant scale in other countries. I am an optimist about this. Nora Bateson, who is a writer that I really enjoy very much, Gregory Bateson's daughter, came up with a term called apocalyptimist, that we may be confronting an apocalypse, but I'm optimistic about our chances to maybe head it off or transcend somehow, build ourselves to a place that we need to be in order to really face these mounting challenges that are of our, largely of our own making. I mean, climate change may not be 100% human caused, but it's largely human caused. And the refusal to look at that is kind of the same thing as the refusal to look at slavery, the refusal to look at colonialism, the refusal of an individual to look at their first marriage or something like that, and to say, what role did I play in getting myself to where I am? And am I willing to do the inner work of personal transformation in order to facilitate an outer transformation? One of the things I talk about in the blog series about diversity and inclusion is a lot of our folks say, oh, well, we're open, anyone is welcome here. But the reality is, if everybody there looks like you, there may be some subtle signs being sent to people that do show up that are different, that they're really not welcome. At least they're not embraced. And they're treated at a distance. They're treated like that young man whose cheek was pinched. The behavior is not welcoming and connecting. It's more distancing and trying to make them a special case or something like that. Yeah. It can be well-meaning but unskillful. So you have to say, why am I doing that? I'm doing it kind of automatically, but I'm doing it ineffectively. So if I'm not willing to look at the unconscious patterns and biases that I have, then I'm very unlikely to make the outward changes that are necessary in order. Because if what you want isn't what you have, and you want something different, the first thing that has to change is something on the inside, because as within, so without, I believe, is a very old maxim. The way my inner thoughts and beliefs and consciousness and feelings is what generates my experience of the world. And if I don't like my experience of the world, my work is internal. And that's true of community as well. Yep. And it's true of nations as well.
Yeah.
So the refusal to do that kind of deep introspective work, in fact, you see people running away from that as fast as they can and denying the need to do it, because I think at some level they realize the pain it will cause, and they may not understand all of the way things connect. There's a lot of complexity to understanding what's going on.
Yeah.
In the world and how things are linked. So.
Yeah, beautifully said. And if I may, I'd just like to add a couple of my aspects of collective shadow that do have my attention, to just add to your brief list, and just as a backdrop that we can share in this conversation, because I know it's impossible to go in depth into really any one of these in a short conversation, much less all of them. But I do like the idea of, just kind of sticking a pin in it and having it there as part of the backdrop of our conversation. One of the largest collective shadow aspects that I have had my attention on for a few years now, and with each month that goes by, it's more so. And that is our basically our negative impact on our shared global habitat. One small aspect of which is climate change, and that in and of itself has such a shadow dynamic being played out writ large in, especially with the USA, where the majority of people in the country are clueless, or maybe they know a little bit about it, but they're annoyed by the conversation. And a strong number of Americans are directly and consciously, willfully ignorant, keep themselves that way about the impact on our world. And there are just a couple of relatively recent updates that kind of sum it up for me in terms of what has me concerned. This is not 2100. This is not even 2050 that I'm looking out to and being concerned about. Mm-hmm. What's often now called the insect apocalypse, where we're losing between 70 and 90% of insects in given pockets of the world. There's another extraordinary statistic that just blows my mind, that we've already lost 50% of the phytoplankton on the planet, and that in addition to being a foundation, a cornerstone of the oceans and that biosystem, also provides 50% of the air, the oxygen that the rest of us on land breathe. Mm-hmm. And so the last one that I wanted to mention was I've just recently run across a small program or project that calls itself Year Zero, in which the trajectory it's really just mathematics. It's really, there's nothing to debate or have denial about. They've just looked at the actual biomass, the amount of wild animals that there are on the planet, and looking from approximately the 80s to now, and roughly 2/3 of wild animals are gone. Mm-hmm. Just the sheer biomass. And then to just draw that line and extend that line out means that by the later 2020s, they will be essentially gone, just following that trajectory. And so I'm bringing these up as a way of just, again, putting a pin in these concerns, which each one of them, any one, and actually the list, I bet you have a long list too. That list goes on and on and on. Yeah. And what most concerns me about it is our collective willful ignorance about it. And then we stir up some dust and some kerfuffle about climate change and parts per million of CO2. And then we go back to business as usual. just doing what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so the implied outcomes that seem fairly self-explanatory, just a matter of really when, those are always a bit of a pressure behind me in any conversation like this. And I'm wondering first if any of the things that I've just mentioned spark you in any particular way worth mentioning. And then as we shift to talking about, what is it to form a more inclusive community with the hopes of being a contribution to the larger community of, in which each of us lives. I'm wondering, how does an aware group hold things of this scale? And so your reactions, and then if you'd like, we can shift to how does a group hold these kind of far larger scale aspects of shadow while trying to move forward in its own growth, its own maturity.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and those numbers you gave, and there are certainly other categories that are equally, disturbing.
Yeah.
And I think how do we hold that? How do you hold impending bad news and unfolding bad news? And again, that gets back to who am I inside? How have I done the work inside to develop myself to a point where I am able to maintain some degree of equanimity in the face of stuff like that, in the face of an alcoholic father, in the face of whatever it may be. If I'm drafted into the military and I'm going to war, how do I survive that and come out in a healthy way? How do I, and you take that and multiply it by 7.5 billion in terms of the number of people. And one kind of extinction rate that you haven't mentioned that does concern me is intelligent politicians. And I don't say that to pick on politicians. I say that to say what is our electorate doing? Because it used to be, and maybe I was living in a bubble, but it used to be that people valued politicians who were smarter than they were. We have always had these big issues. They may not have been as impending, but there's always been big issues. There was the Cold War. There was, the World War II. There was all the other stuff that's been going on. It's not like massive human problems are new. But we always tended to have some faith that we would put people into office that would create programs and fund programs and enable programs that would support the science, that would support the engineering, that would support the other kinds of things, the universities, the places where people would gather to deal with these kinds of problems. And even the corporate world was involved in that for a long time. And today we seem to have moved into, in the West, what triggers it for me, or triggered it for me for some time ago, was an election about 20 years ago where people started saying, "Would I want to have a beer with this guy who wants to run for president?"
Right.
And my answer was, I don't want anybody president I want to have a beer with.
Yeah.
I want somebody who's president who is so smart and so dedicated and so clear and so able to communicate and so understanding of the myriad issues that face us. And we'll say we need a solid NASA, we need a solid National Weather Service, we need good universities, and we need research grants and the National Institutes of Health and so forth. And since the 1980s in the United States, many of those agencies have seen effectively their budget cut. We've seen support for research move into the corporate sector, and at the same time, the corporate sector has become less socially responsible and is looking at bottom line stuff primarily. We see, I don't think it's that different in Europe. I think the EU is a little more forward thinking than the US, but just the conversations of everyday people that I run into here, it's still this, oh, that leader is too snooty or too, we want statesmen and women. We want the best people with the best minds to be in these decision-making posts representing us. And that seems to be an endangered species.
Yeah.
Pretty much across the spectrum and even when someone does look pretty bright, we snipe at their ankles. They're not but 20 years ago you did a tweet, or you didn't take a perfect position on 100% of the issues I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're creating a society that is simply hastening its own doom,
yeah.
as opposed to intelligently looking at what do we need to do? Because I think we have the tools to do what we need to do. There was a wonderful article today I put up on my Facebook page. It's basically looking back on climate change from 2050 and all the things we did right. And it basically takes a look at that if many of the technologies and much of the knowledge that we currently have were applied intelligently and funded, that a lot of the more significant issues could be slowed, and then we begin to move into an upward swing. But where's the political will to do that? Where's the political will to fund it? Where's the attitude of the businesses that in World War II said, yeah, we'll stop making cars and start making tanks? I don't know that that's there. And that without that, it almost doesn't matter if we have the answers, if we're not able to implement them.
If I may, I'd like to just tag on the more personal or the more individual level expression of what I think you're pointing at. That is, depending on which survey I've looked at in the past 5 years, there's a fairly consistent range of between 2/3 and 3/4 of Americans surveyed say that they do not have conversations of consequence. Excuse me, do not have conversations of consequence even with people very close to them. To say nothing of conversations of consequence with people in circles further away, less familiar. That's mind-blowing to me. And so while you're describing the intelligence of politicians and how we are collectively, it seems like inviting lowering the bar with regard to that statespersonship and leadership and just good common sense involved with all things political and so on. I'm wondering also about the level. What's going on in our brains, Jim, that has us not talking to one another about things of consequence at both the very intimate level, the very familial level, and so on, and especially then in layers out from there. It seems like until some sort of change or shift in the tide of that, I think what you and I are talking about is really the downfall of the social contract and ultimately of society as we know it. Sorry to go on such a kind of downer track, but how does that? Is there anything I included in that more kind of individual level that sparks you in any way?
Yeah, and I think you could tie that to the fact that people don't read seriously the way they used to. where you would talk about a book, a nonfiction book that you had read,
Mm-hmm.
or a novel that brought out some kind of interesting, talking at the beginning, we were talking about meaning.
Yep.
And these conversations about meaning can be difficult to have partly because of the way we socialize today. If you're afraid, it's like a minefield. You're afraid to say the wrong thing to the wrong person because to disagree has become a mortal sin, where it used to be something, oh, great, we disagree. Let's have a really great conversation.
Right.
And I think part of that has to do with shadow issues. Part of it has to do with, can I see myself as having something valuable to say? And also, is there someone who is at least willing to listen? They don't have to agree with me, but are they willing to listen, as opposed to shouting me down or calling me wrong, or all the things that we do when we're instead of saying, wow, we had a great conversation. Like, I'm thinking of Hamilton and Jefferson, and back in actually it was John Adams and Jefferson that had the great disagreement on what the United States should be like. And yet they had conversations all the time. They didn't like each other because of their opinions, but they had these great ideas, and they got into the arena, and they kind of bashed heads. And interesting, they both died on July 4th. And, it was just kind of there was kind of I think there's also I think there's two unseen forces that we're not taking into account. And one is the mysticism that has to do with relationship. And the other is evolution. I think that the evolutionary forces are often surprising in terms of how they show up. And part of my optimism is that evolution may just present us with some amazing possibilities to move beyond some of the current problems, or at least to ameliorate them to some extent. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think having meaningful conversations, I like to do that. And when I travel around, so often I'll talk to someone I haven't seen for 5 years, and they'll say, man, I miss having conversations like this.
Right. Right.
Because it is kind of difficult. Wayne Dyer, the New Age author, used to talk about, he called it drapery talk, where you get together and talk about nothing, or the weather, or how are the kids. And that's as far as anything went, because we feel unsafe or insecure to go further. And I think part of it is we're not reading the way we used to. We're not as well read. We don't have a developed idea. The world is way more complex. There's so much more to talk about, and the linkages of things is more difficult. You have to kind of pay attention. And so I think, and I think social media has made us or given us the opportunity to be very lazy communicators.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Well, finally, I would love to shift gears, if we could, to more of the real bones of what had me contact you and ask for this conversation, and that was your series of so far 4 blog posts about creating an inclusive community. Now, it's clear that the majority of your audience is involved with some sort of spiritual community in the first place. It sounds like many of them. I'm sorry, Center for Spiritual Living, was that? Yeah. So
that's the name of the organization. It's part of there's a larger group called American New Thought. But it's and it was all developed in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States.
Great. So it sounds like many of the folks who read your blog and are connected with you have at least some amount of exposure to that environment. Safe to say?
Yes.
Great. So I would just like to take a chance here and just see if we can bridge to folks who may or may not know a darn thing about that particular community on any level. But let's just explore a bit about what had you take on this role of being a mentor. You've obviously had some success at building out community where you've gone. You've got some amount of acuity, some amount of knowledge, some amount of wisdom and experience with regard to this. And I see you're putting out such, I think, beautifully crafted offerings that I who have no exposure to you or the greater organization you're describing, I'm drawn in. I love the pieces you're putting together. And I'd love to hear just a little bit about, if you could tell us, so what might it look like if there were someone from the greater community you're speaking to, how would they put your blog posts or your coaching of them into practice? How does a local organization, let's just say that there's one here in Medford, Oregon, which I believe there is.
There is.
How much?
I've spoken there, actually.
Great. I'm sorry I missed it. How do folks start to put your suggestions into motion? And what are they? What are some of the challenges that you know that they're grappling with? And what are you helping them see?
Mm-hmm.
And why I'm asking for this is, and I'm hoping that it's obvious enough to the people that I have watching this podcast, because I think we're terrible at it. We who are not connected with that spiritual community, who are pretty much scattered around the world and have almost no real community to speak of for the average person in the what could be called the doomosphere. If you have apocalyptimists on one side, we definitely have doomers on the other.
Sure.
And what I notice is that there is almost nothing offered in terms of how to build community, how to seriously build out our capacity individually and collectively to have a present and a future that's worth living into, even no matter really what the circumstances are. So let me just stop there and see if that sparks you to share with us about what you're trying to say in your blog posts.
Well, a little bit about why I do what I do. I was active, we call them ministers, back in the early 20th century. The founder of our philosophy, his name was Ernest Holmes, thought, and I think he thought correctly at the time, that the best way to help people move from a more traditional organized religion into our kind of teaching was to have some of the Christian trappings. So we called them churches, we had ministers and so forth. And some of that still exists and some of it doesn't. But I did that for 20 years in 4 different spiritual communities. And I've always had an interest in organizational development for some reason. And my wife's an organizational development consultant. Mm-hmm. And a lot of our conversation is about organizational development. But anyway, when I retired, and we traveled full time for about 3 years, and I just started writing this blog. I want to do something. I want to keep my finger in. I realized I had a kind of a prized role as kind of an insider-outsider, because I had been on the board of directors of the central organization for a number of years and so forth. But no, I was really on the outside. I didn't have any roles. I didn't have a community, a member community of the organization or anything. So I thought maybe what I can do is speak to some of the sacred cows that I think need to be gotten rid of in order for us as an organization and individual communities to progress. Because some of the old form was actually keeping people, whereas it used to attract people, It was now keeping people away. So how do you help leadership transition through that, understand the dynamics of what's happening, why it's happening, why are there fewer people in the seats? Maybe why is it important to live stream? Why is it important to be more, there's all kinds of different, and I blogged about, I do 1 or 2 blogs a week for the last 3-4 years. So there's quite a few of them. But what I really try to help people understand is that whenever we make these decisions, like for example, in this 4-part series that I've just completed, there will be a guest blogger commenting on it in a week or so. I said, it's not just about saying we're welcoming to a people that are different from the people that are already here. There's a number of dynamics. There's different layers to this. And for example, I talk about the macro layer. Demographics. Are you in a place where diversity is even possible? If you're in the suburbs, you're probably very, very, very white, with a few exceptions in the United States, because let's look, why is that? Well, because the suburbs were pretty intentionally made and kept white through redlining and all kinds of other practices that happened in the 50s and 60s, and those patterns have never really been broken, except for in a few places like parts of Atlanta and so forth. So you're going to have to deal with that. Most of our communities that are very diverse are urban. They're not either suburban or rural. But there's still diversity there. There may be LGBTQIA folks who may be hidden. They may not be open in the suburbs as they are maybe in the urban area, but they're there. So if they're not in your community, then you have to say, okay, what do I need to change? It's not just throwing open the doors and say we're here. So you have the macro culture, that demographics. Then you have the local culture, and that's one of the focuses. What is your local community culture? Is it open or closed? Are people there primarily for social reasons, or is there some deep spiritual work going on? Is it large or small? When a newcomer comes in, are they welcomed in an effective way, or are they chased away because they're overwelcomed or underwelcomed, or they're made to feel, oh my God, we have no one here like you, that kind of thing. And then finally, the individual psychology of the leadership, of the individual people in the community, our own, if I'm a spiritual leader of a community and I have unconscious biases like everybody else, and if I haven't explored those, I may unconsciously drive people away just by making an offhand comment or something like that. And I'm wondering why they left, So these are this isn't unique to our New Thought community. This could be true anywhere. And certainly, as I was working on this series, we had the situation with the United Methodist Church, where they had the vote that they would not accept LGBTQIA within, and that's probably going to create a schism. Because one thing we need is even more Christian denominations. I think there's officially close to 1,000 now, but there used to be 1. So what we see in religion, organized religion, is greater division. We don't agree anymore, then we'll take this church and, half the church will go over here and the other half go over here. Whereas what is needed for humanity is connection. So how do we heal what we need to heal in order to facilitate connection rather than unconsciously continuing to create division? And it's about becoming conscious of what we need to become, our shadow, our repressed stuff, our unconscious biases, ideas like white privilege, gender fluidity, which requires some complexity of thought and requires some emotional work for most of us to accept if they haven't been part of our experience up to this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, I keep wanting to go toward some of the more pernicious issues that I know folks in my audience tend to bump up against. You know, they're really there's so much tension just in the conversation about climate change. Is it a real thing? Does it really? Is it something that we want to talk about? And so on. But I think I'm guessing that that's not nearly as hot a topic as the inclusivity issues that you keep bringing up. So I'd like
well,
to.
let me just speak to that for just a second. I would say it certainly is on everybody's mind, but how an individual spiritual community deals with climate change on a grand scale, other than maybe local action, trying to influence local policy, state policy, and we do have communities that are engaged in that.
Right.
The idea of inclusivity is something that is kind of part of the bread and butter of every spiritual community,
right?
Whether they've dealt with it or not. So it's not it's not one or the other, but I think they're simply different levels or different aspects of how community would be engaged.
I get it. So can you perhaps just walk us through perhaps a couple of examples of communities having with whom you are consulting or that you're aware of, what it has looked like as they've grappled with some of these issues, and especially when there's been some sort of a win, some sort of a positive movement as a result of sincere exploration. I'd love to hear some encouraging news about that kind of localized evolution.
Well, we certainly have had we have about probably 400 or 500 spiritual communities, mostly in North America, but a few scattered around the world. There's one near me in Geneva where I'm going to be over a couple of weeks. But I'm just kind of left to each individual community in terms of what they might do in terms of social engagement. Mm-hmm. And this certainly falls under that. Is, are you going to be petitioning? Are you going to be protesting? Are you going to be doing? So we have a couple of communities that do sanctuary programs for illegal aliens. We have a center in Dallas that's very socially engaged, and they've organized very large prayer vigils outside the legislature and the city hall, mainly over racial issues, police shootings, but they've also held vigils to support the police, recognizing that it's not about making enemies. It's about how do we encourage, we don't want to get rid of the police, so how do we help the police to become more conscious? How do we help the police to become more effective? So you have things like that. There's a thing called the Charter for Compassion, which you may be aware of. Mm-hmm. And a number of our local communities have encouraged their local governments to take on the Charter of Compassion as a city or a town project, and a number of them have done that. Now you might say, what's that got to do with climate change? Well, that might be a small step in encouraging greater compassion, and then when an issue related to climate change comes up, a few of those politicians or the civil servants might be thinking from a more compassionate place as they think about that. So I think we try to look at things in a holistic way, because everything's connected somehow, and a lot of it you don't know how it's connected. So what I try to encourage communities to do in terms of social action, or we call it social engagement, spiritually motivated social engagement, is to say, what's important to your people? What's important to the local community where you are? What's important to the people that are present in your community? What can you do to help them engage within a meaningful way to them? And use spiritual principles of truth, of compassion, of and so forth, so that when we do engage, we're there peacefully, we're there nonviolently, we're there compassionately, as opposed to charging in with anger which certainly may feel good, but it may not be the best overall strategy. So, not saying it never works, but I don't think it ever works long term.
Yep.
I'm seeing in France now, we have the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, and they're all over the place. And here in Lyon, there's been groups, and every Saturday there's wafts of tear gas coming down the Rhone River and things from their engagements. And I think there's a movement there without a collective idea of meaning, without a collective leadership, and they're splintered and they're losing the support of the people they had because they're not operating with any sense of compassion, with any sense of recognition that anyone with a different point of view may have some validity to their point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing that can lead to is either you win or you lose. And in community, you can't play zero-sum games, or you don't have community.
Yeah.
So how do we find something that works that and probably involves some people either realizing there's a bigger or better idea, or getting upset and leaving.
Yep.
It's a big challenge, and spiritual leaders don't like to appear to be anything other than nice. Right. So, that can make it a little difficult to have some difficult conversations with people.
Right.
So, and that, again, that can be true in the workplace. That can be true in a lot of different organizations. But what I work with are people that are, working with people who are spiritually motivated and who want to engage with the community around them in positive ways. And so how can we help to enable them to do that as a community?
Great. We're heading toward the closing of this envelope of this conversation, and I just I'm so glad that we've done this, and I hope against hope that this is not our last time talking, because I think there are many different dimensions to this conversation that I hope is useful for you, because it is very definitely useful for me, and I believe for many of the folks who might be watching this in the coming weeks and months. Jim, I'm wondering if you could just spend a bit more time and help translate just a bit more of what you were just sharing. I was hearing you point at a few of the elements that are necessary if a community wants to grow itself, wants to evolve in a good way, and a few of the elements that when they occur, it tends to be corrosive. So I was hearing you kind of point at a few examples of both sides, what seems to help, what seems to be corrosive. I'm wondering if you could just for a few moments be sort of prescriptive, or be the organizational development consultant role, and for those of us who are interested, even at the smallest level, those of us who are grappling with a shared view of, we have massive predicaments that we're grappling with, and it tends to be a very lonely experience for many of the people kind of at the far end of the doomosphere that I was just describing earlier. It's not an easy place, and I'm certain that this organizational development frame and this kind of spiritual coach frame that you have is extraordinarily needed and useful for those of us who find ourselves in this kind of lonely end of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And could you suggest any number of resources or any number of these kind of building blocks that you've been talking about of a spiritual community or a small community of like-minded folks, how can they build themselves out? What's useful? What are useful elements for them to pay attention to as they build themselves out in number and in depth? Just any of the basics that you would be suggesting
Okay.
in the spiritual community, but this is perhaps to a slightly more secular and a more diverse community. We need the basics, and if you have anything to suggest, we're eagerly awaiting any suggestions.
Well, in just a few minutes we have left, I would say the most important thing is the mental health of the people in the organization and leadership. There needs to be stability, there needs to be clarity, there needs to be people that are not driven by their own ego needs to the point where they will put aside the purpose of the organization to have people make them look good or whatever. You know, we've all been around narcissistic leaders and things like that. And that can be difficult. I think you have to have a really good BS detector. Mm-hmm. And when you do go into a community or have the possibility of putting together a community, when that thing goes off, it might be time to move along and look for somebody else. Mm-hmm. Because you spend so much energy. When I work going to a community that's in dysfunction, and everybody's well-meaning, but you've got people that haven't done their work. They've got issues, you know, character flaws, whatever it may be, and all the energy goes into dealing with that. And if they do get out into the world, they create more problems than they solve. So I think an inner commitment among the leadership, when I worked with a board, I was really, really having a lot of one-on-one conversations about how you doing, what do you need, is there something in your life that's keeping you from functioning where you need to function, let's talk about it, refer people to therapy, here's a book you need to look at, and because I think if we, as above, so below, so it's as within, so without, as above, so below, as the leadership is in terms of setting the atmosphere, those that are followers will tend to mirror that. So you need good leaders and you need good followers. And if you're going to have a structureless organization, well, that may be another story. Then everybody's got to be stable, because that's what we're having with the Gilets jaunes. They're structuralist, relatively speaking, and they're not being effective the way they could be.
Yeah.
So I think, it sounds easy to say, and certainly what you find is the least mentally healthy person in the place thinks they're the most mentally healthy person in the place. But I think it's important, I try to do my own work. I read a lot. I've been in therapy. I talk to people that I trust, and I say, tell me, am I on the beam or am I off the beam here? I just think that's so critical. Yeah. That we have a couple of close relationships in our lives where we can be radically honest. And if I can't be honest with myself, I'm probably not going to be a good leader. I'm probably going to make some choices that are damaging, that are, I just don't think there's anything more important than that. Than having as a core value of any community that we're all being as mentally healthy as we can be. We're all doing our work to stay on top of things. Yeah. And then the structure follows that. The structure has to follow the purpose. So what's your purpose? What's your vision? And so the structure of the organization, what a lot of people do is structure an organization and say, what are we going to do? And they find out they've got the wrong structure, but it's too late to change it. So I think form has to follow function. That, you figure out your purpose, you vision, you sit back, you get with your key people, and before anybody even opened the doors, and a group of people gets together and starts saying, who are we? What are we about? What's important? What's not important? And get all that clear, and then you open the doors to other people. And you might say, well, do we have time to do that? Well, if you don't do that, you're going to spend so much energy spinning your wheels that you won't be effective in the long run.
Yeah.
It's the old analogy of the oxygen mask falling in the plane, and you put yours on before the child's, because you're no good to the child if you can't function. And I see over and over, particularly in some of these organizations dealing with critical issues, that people become true believers, and they shut off to any other viewpoints, and they try to kind of turn into bulls and just run right through the problem. And it rarely works, and it makes a lot of other people that might get involved and be effective say, I don't want to be around that.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge. I don't see a bigger challenge than to stay balanced, than to do self-assessments, than to have leadership teams that are honestly communicating with each other. I think those are the critical factors.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm just so, I feel so deeply validated in the work that we're putting together here in Living Resilience, but also in a few of the little subgroups of this doomosphere, the arena in which people are, really self-selecting to see that things are coming much faster and more intensely than we tend to hear about in the news, or certainly in conversation, social conversation. And the orientation that we've got going on here is very similar, is that without doing this inner work, without having the clarity of purpose, the reclaiming of agency, the a tremendous amount of attention and intent on reconnecting with the primary sources of meaning in a human life. Without these things, even the most sincere group or individual is just going to be exhausted.
Yeah. Yeah, you've got to be in good shape to do this work. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
And mentally and physically, because it's so demanding. And again, if you're in leadership and people have to be taking care of you, as opposed to working toward the issue and so forth, then that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, Jim Lockard, I will be putting the links to the episodes of your blog, your posts that we've been talking about, we've been pointing at. I'll be putting those in the show notes, and of course your blog's address as well. I'm curious, is there any other way that you'd like to be contacted, or people could find out more about you that would not be included in that short list?
No, you can connect with me via the blog. I'm on Twitter as @Jim Lockard, Lockard. And I do a wine blog, but that's another story.
Okay, maybe we can cover that next time.
Yeah. And I've been to the wine country out by Medford, so in the Rogue Valley and so forth. So there's some nice things going on.
There's some very nice things going on. It's pretty obvious that the wine country is shifting north, and they're doing a
here too. It's shifting up into England and Scandinavia.
Right. So, Jim, again, I just want to take a moment to thank you again for taking a call, so to speak, from someone out of left field, and I just really appreciate your generosity of spirit and your obvious mastery in the things that you're offering in your blog, and I imagine in your coaching as well. And I was sincere that I hope that this is not our last time. I would be thrilled if we could get back together, say in a few months. And
I think that can happen without a problem.
That would be great.
And I do have to run now. I do have another call coming up right now. So
thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who listened, and feel free to get in touch via the blog or Twitter or whatever. Okay, thank you.
Shall do. Thank you again for your
pleasure, and I think it's important work.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safecircle calls.